So it is interesting to be a co-chair of the U.S.-China Working Group these days. It could be a curse, only because going back and forth from China and visiting gives you some perspective on the U.S.-China relationship, and that relationship literally came home in my district, as my district was the first district in the country. We have patient one for coronavirus. And so China is really in the news in my district these days, with this person who flew from Wuhan to Singapore and Seattle, and is in isolation in hospital. And I want to bring all this up because this is in the news. We had a briefing yesterday on Capitol Hill, and I want to clearly convey to you that your local public health officers know what they're doing to address this. The plan is in place. They responded magnificently as a public health system, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have been giving us a great amount of support, and that story exists in the other states where there's a coronavirus patient as well. So we're still watching this very closely, but that's sort of the sort of, like I said, I didn't know as part of the U.S.-China Working Group and being co-chair that have to deal with this too, but indeed we do. So I'm glad to be here with Darren and give you a little update on a few things. Just a quick background on my district again. About 40% of the jobs in the state, in Washington State, depend upon trade. About 60% of the jobs in Snohomish County, which is my home county, depend on trade, largely because of the presence of the Boeing manufacturing facility. But it's not just Boeing, it's a lot of companies that are involved in trade. So U.S.-China trade and trade with Mexico and Canada and trade overall is very important for the district. The U.S.-China Working Group obviously has been around for a while. We really try to be bipartisan. We do understand the need for engagement on trade and on many other issues. We recognize that education and dialogue is key to achieving long-term U.S. Goals and U.S. interests in this relationship. But it does not just matter for folks in this room. As I noted, it matters for the people that we get the privilege to serve in Congress. I would note that as well, I think the current status of the relationship overall, if it was a roller coaster, I think we're on a dip in that relationship, despite the phase one trade deal, because this trade is only part of that relationship that we have with China, and there's a lot going on with that. There's 3 species of China hawks in the U.S. House of Representatives, and they used to fly in separate flocks. The national security hawks, the economic hawks, and the human rights hawks, they've all found each other under this administration and are flying together, which has changed the center of gravity on the U.S.-China relationships in Congress and in the country. Despite that, the phase one trade deal was done. It does resolve some of the issues at stake in the ongoing trade war. It's, I think, perhaps a respite, but not an end. Includes limited relief for farmers and manufacturers. But chief issues in this relationship, including China's support for state-owned enterprises, forced joint ventures and tech transfers, market access, are barely addressed. Slightly addressed, but barely addressed. There's still a lot of work to be done as well. And independent of these negotiations, the U.S. does need to embark on a broader strategy to get its own economic house in order. And I don't believe that we're doing enough at home to really deal with some of the longer-term issues that we need to address in order to be competitive overall as a country relative to China. On USMCA, I voted for that, and really pleased to see the president sign that. The final agreement reflected priorities that House Democrats fought for, like labor, environmental standards, strict enforcement. The agreement included provisions that were born in the negotiations for TPP, to modernize rules on digital trade as well. Those migrated into USMCA. But the USMCA is not a set it and forget it agreement. We're going to need to really live up to the enforcement mechanisms that were put in place in order to build the foundation, I think, for any future discussions on future trade agreements, because that was the biggest point of contention looking back to Obama, to Bush, to Clinton, to Bush. The lack of enforcement of trade agreements is really something that sticks in the craw of workers around the country, and so being able to enforce these agreements is critical. So I want to conclude by stealing something from a guy named Bruce Melman, who some of you might know. So Bruce does a quarterly deck, a slide deck, and I'm on that list. And I called him yesterday, or I don't want to mislead anybody. I emailed him yesterday. I emailed him yesterday, asked if I could use a slide out of his slide deck. He said that was okay. So it's his, and it's really good. So I want to give him credit. So his latest slide deck is called Knowns and Unknowns. And there's a lot of knowns and a lot of unknowns. But on trade, he listed out on the known, no one can see this, but this is the slide from it. It's actually live. And look at Matt. What do you guys remember? So on the knowns, it says the U.S.-China trade war is here. So despite the Phase 1 deal, tensions will grow, driven by export controls, tougher CFIUS rules, and ICT supply chain regulations. There's still $370 billion in tariffs, in U.S. tariffs, still $110 billion in China tariffs, variety of other things. The Made in China 2025 campaign, although renamed, still exists, and China is still investing in competing national champions. And then there's issues of human rights and regional risks, as we know about Taiwan and Hong Kong. So those are the knowns in trade. And then he talks about the unknowns. Is a U.S.-EU trade war unavoidable? So we've got, although they won't be part of EU in about 36 hours, the UK has made a decision to adopt Huawei technology for their 5G network, while U.S. policy is clearly trying to convince friends and allies not to do that. There's a EU drive for technological sovereignty, U.S. putting tariffs on EU steel and aluminum, EU climate change tariffs are threatened, U.S. auto tariffs, the U.S. The Boeing Airbus U.S. retaliation and EU subsidies issue, and WTO, and so on. So those are the unknowns. So the bottom line, I guess, from this deck and from my discussion is there's a lot of work left for people who are involved in trade. It's not, we can maybe pat ourselves a little bit on the back, getting past Phase 1 to whatever Phase 2, whatever the heck that is, and getting past USMCA. But there's a lot of work to be done. Finally, I will note that the Armed Services Committee, which I serve on, asked the Center for I just call it CNAS, and I'm just terrible. I've been on the Armed Services Committee so long, I'm starting to use acronyms I don't even know what they mean. The Center for New American Security. In the 2019 NDAA defense bill, we asked the Center for New American Security to do a broad-based brush on U.S.-China policy, and that came out 2 days ago. It's called Rising to the China Challenge. Eli Ratner was the lead author on this, and it's basically, again, I know it's a trade discussion, there's 100 separate recommendations covering the whole ball field on changes or emphasis that we need to have in this U.S.-China relationship. Well beyond trade, well beyond national security as well, and perhaps sets a benchmark for how to judge U.S.-China policy today. So with that, I'll end and turn it over to Darren.
Well, thank you. if you haven't noticed, Rick and I are also members of the Tall Caucus in the House. Let me just thank Ripon and Jim and your entire team for all the work you do and for putting on this breakfast today. And for everybody in the room here, your engagement on trade and being here today is a great opportunity to visit with you a little bit about a few things going on in trade. And I want to make sure we save some time for questions from you. If you would have asked me 6 or 7 months ago how we looked in terms of USMCA, Phase 1, Japan, I think I was pretty pessimistic, wasn't sure the direction we were going to go. And as we sit here today, in my district, the 4 largest trading partners that we have, Canada, Mexico, China, and Japan, we have trade agreements with. And how did we get there? And how, and these results that we got are obviously beneficial. And I think the common denominator with all of those is Bob Lighthizer. And I don't know if you listened to the signing ceremony yesterday, but I thought Bob Lighthizer was the best speaker and talked about how he got it done. But I can't emphasize enough his capabilities, and particularly if you look at the vote margin in the House, 380 votes. That was never expected to happen, I think, over this last year. But what Lighthizer had is Democrats respected him. He met with them at every turn on every single issue. He had skin in the game with them on both sides of the Capitol. And I think that helped. Plus, he's a very smart person when it comes to trade. He's worked at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think that helped to get it through. Just to remind everybody in the room a little bit about the district that I'm fortunate to represent, West Central Illinois. My district's the 8th largest in the country in terms of corn and soybean production. So we send a lot of soybeans and corn around the world, particularly to China and Japan and other places. We also have the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers anywhere in the world. Make a lot of D10 tractors and mining equipment and excavators that we ship around the world. John Deere is right outside of my district, and we engage with them on a lot of trade issues also. We also produce 97% of the pumpkins in the world come from our district. So if you're eating pumpkin pie, most likely it originated in my district. So, but obviously trade in my district is vitally important. And the Mississippi River is my western boundary, and the Illinois River runs through my district. And so that inland waterway system, we load up lots of products, whether it's corn and soybean or fertilizer or ethanol or Caterpillar products, and they go down that river to New Orleans. They get offloaded on ships and go all around the world. And so in a rural district like mine, trade is important. It equals jobs and economic opportunities. And so how do we, here in Congress, I've tried to engage on those issues because they affect my district parochially, but they help the country. Let me just touch base on Phase 1. I was at the White House yesterday for the USMCA signing, and I was also there a couple weeks ago for Phase 1. And from an agriculture perspective, the purchase agreements in there are solid. They're really good. About 50 to 60 billion dollars over the next 2 years in ag purchases is positive. Overall, about 200 billion dollars in other purchases that'll come out of Phase 1. And that's beneficial, I think, for our country. In terms of the enforcement mechanisms that we ultimately wanted there on intellectual property and technology, we didn't get those in Phase 1. And so obviously that's part of Phase 2. I think Lighthizer and others will admit to you those are going to be the toughest issues to negotiate on. So I think we got the best deal possible at this point that we could. And I think, again, it's progress. We have some issue. We have a dispute resolution mechanism in there. Again, with China, you got to figure out how they implement that, how they maintain that, how do they enforce that. So we'll be watching to see how those issues. As many of us know, when China was brought into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the argument was bring them in, and they're going to rise to our standards. They're going to abide by our rules. They're going to engage in the same system that every other industrialized country in the world has done. Well, clearly that hasn't happened on technology, intellectual property, and lots of the issues related to state-owned enterprises. So with this dispute resolution in there, we'll see if that changes at all. But obviously, having a hammer over their head on this, I'm not sure we get there in phase one, but we're going to have to wait and see on that, on how that plays out. The other thing that I think is important as we sit here today, obviously when this administration came in 3 years ago on trade, they've had a going at it alone approach, right? Traditionally, we've gathered our allies and we've engaged. You look at TPP, which I was a strong supporter of, and doing it with other countries. Well, they had a going at it alone approach, and Lighthizer will tell you that. But I think what USMCA and Phase 1 and the Japan deal shows our allies that we can negotiate trade agreements, that we can get things done. And if you look at the 24 chapters in USMCA, they're really precedent setting when it comes to intellectual property and technology. You look at the cross-border flows, language in there, cyber theft, cyber security. I mean, these are things, we wrote the rules. And much of this came from TPP, which is a good thing, but it sets the standard for future trade agreements. And I think that's a good thing for the U.S. And we've heard the expression, I think the other thing that, how did we get these trade deals done? I think the other thing is, it's the expression, if you're strong at home, you can be strong abroad. And I think our economy, if you look at the numbers, you look at the growth, you look at the prosperity, I think people recognize around the world our economy is pretty good. It's a pretty good bet right now. And so I think that's, and I think the Trump administration used that leverage as we engaged in these negotiations. It showed those other countries you needed to do that. But again, I think we've put together a very good agreement with USMCA. I didn't agree with everything in there. I think those of us that are really true free traders, there's a number of provisions in there that I criticized Lighthizer on early on, sunset provision, rules of origin, ISDS, some of these things we're not traditionally aware of. So we'll have to see how those things play out. But again, 85% of it is good. And to get it across the finish line in a bipartisan way, I think is a positive thing. Well, I told Ambassador Lighthizer yesterday, I want to see if we can make him the infrastructure czar, because that's the next thing we need to get done. Or maybe he can work on Middle East peace. But he has done a real service to President Trump. I can't emphasize that enough. Working in a bipartisan way and put together a great team to get this across the finish line. And overall, it's good for the country. We all know we're less than 5% of the world's population. We have to have customers. We have to have market share around the world to prosper and succeed with arguably the best companies anywhere in the world. In my state of Illinois, 40% of the products we grow, produce, or manufacture go to Canada or Mexico. And again, this trade agreement helps to pursue that moving forward. Last thing I would just say, on the Ways and Means Committee, as we look at 2020 and we look at, as Rick mentioned, England, I think that's on the horizon for a free trade agreement. We're looking at India, which looks much more condensed trade agreement, particularly on ag. And of course, Brazil's a ways down the road. But again, I think we've set the precedent. We've showed our allies. We've showed the world we can engage in good, substantive trade agreements. And I think that'll bode well for us. Thank you.